Great, thanks everybody. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Endangered Species Act today. And so the federal ESA is one of the premier pieces of environmental legislation in the United States. So it currently protects over 1,600 different taxa nationwide. And the number of taxa continues to grow annually. So the variance is quite large, as you can see, on a year-to-year basis. But importantly, the cumulative listing curve shown here doesn't really show any signs of reaching an asymptote quite yet. And so the continued addition of new species will, in the future, continue to orchestrate really significant changes to the conservation landscape in the US nationwide as it relates to species-specific conservation goals. And so up until recently, one of the primary and really often used ways of adding species to the ESA is what's known as the multi-species or mega petition. And so these are basically documents that consolidate dozens or sometimes even hundreds of different species into a single petition. And that consolidation is based off of one or more of several factors, which can include the taxonomic relatedness of those component species, shared life history traits, or even something as broad as sort of their general geographic ranges. And so the idea being that by consolidating the species in this fashion, that you're increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of that listing process by reducing redundancy in multiple petitions that have virtually the same language involved for justifying adding particular species. So these are just a few cases of those types of mega petitions in the last few years. And so the federal the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the federal agency that manages and implements the ESA as it relates to terrestrial and freshwater species, really sort of advocated this strategy of mega petitions starting in 1994, again as a way to sort of increase that efficiency and effectiveness of that process, to reduce that agency's processing time and get species that warrant federal protection under this law under that protection as swiftly as possible. Now, interestingly, in 2016, they actually reversed their position completely and instituted a complete regulatory ban on mega petitions. And they based that decision primarily off of anecdotal evidence on the sort of abuse at some level of that process, whereby mega petitions were no longer including sufficient data on the individual species, but were rather just sort of consolidated documents with very vague language and vague citations about general patterns of either habitat loss or anthropogenic pressure on ecosystems, and very little specific information to justify the particular species that were being included in these mega petitions. So a standard sort of length of species-specific text could sometimes be less than a page in some of these mega petitions. Now, as you might imagine, that sort of created a little bit of a controversy, particularly among advocacy organizations and conservation organizations, for which these mega petitions had become a really central part of their sort of modus operandi in the environmental world. And I just want to highlight this particular quote here, sort of that these rules are being premised on myths, not facts. And there's a little bit of truth to that and a little bit of truth to sort of both sides of this argument, in that neither the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service nor the Center for Biological Diversity or other advocacy organizations really had a lot of peer-reviewed literature or hard empirical evidence to support either position as to whether or not this ban was a justified decision. And so that's where sort of I want to jump into this for the rest of this presentation, is providing some empirical evidence relating to whether or not this mega petition ban is something that's justified or not. And in particular, I'm going to focus on this 2012 mega petition that proposed to list 53 species of reptile and amphibian species across the United States. And I want to start by focusing on two particular species that were included in this mega petition, for which I have a lot of survey data and background information, because they're central foci of other parts of my dissertation. So these two species are the Panamint alligator lizard and the Inyo Mountain salamander. So these are roughly co-distributed species in the Mojave and Great Basin deserts of Eastern California. They have relatively restricted geographic ranges, as you can see. So the Panamint alligator lizard is known from approximately 36 localities. The Inyo Mountain salamander is known from approximately 24 localities. And what we sort of looked at when we emphasized sort of a literature review, both the white and the gray literature for these two animals, supplemented with about 5 seasons worth of survey data covering the majority of those known localities for those two species. And then we sort of compared that data set against some of the claims that were made in the mega petition advocating that these species weren't listing. And so there were a lot of discrepancies that we came up with, and I want to highlight just a few of the key ones here. So first off, all known populations of both of those species occur only on lands that are managed by the federal government. So there are no privately owned populations that we're aware of at this point. And that really directly contradicts some of the language that was included in the mega petition. So in particular for the Panamanian alligator lizard, the mega petition cited a really outdated document that basically says the opposite, that the majority of known lizard locations are on private lands. We're not really sure where that citation, where they got that information, because it was incorrect even in 1994 when it was first put out there, but it certainly is not true today. Again, all known populations are on federally managed land that generally maintains its natural character. These are not developed federal lands. These are quite remote parts of the western deserts. And so what this translates to with respect to this federal land ownership is that we see no evidence of any population extirpations for either of these two species. There's no evidence that any population has undergone or is continuing to undergo any sort of decline. And there's no major loss of habitat, although historically some of the habitats were somewhat degraded, and through management activities, those anthropogenic impacts have been lessened over time. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so again, all 3 of these factors, extirpations, declines, loss of habitat, these are 3 factors that were directly contradicted in the mega petition language for both of these species, in large part due to misinterpretations of the existing evidence, or just overlooking relevant citations entirely. So some pretty clear evidence of discrepancies there. And then the next thing I did was to sort of look at, again, based off of that survey data set and literature, a threat assessment. And so we identified these 12 different threats that either were currently or potentially could be presumed to affect either or both of these two species on the landscape. And then we quantified them into 4 separate bins related to the geographic distribution, or sort of how widespread these threats were to the populations. So a score of 0, meaning that threat currently, to the best of our knowledge, affects no populations of either species, all the way up to a 3, which represents that threat currently impacting over 50% of the known populations. And so really the pattern that I want you guys to take note of here, that there's a lot of 0s and a lot of 1s in this table. And so generally speaking, these are not species that are being affected by a large number of threats on the landscape, just based on what we know at the known localities where the critters occur. And so once again, relating this back to the mega petition language, a lot of discrepancies here with respect to the mega petition overemphasizing a lot of these threats, when in fact on the ground evidence suggests that they are not currently impacting any known populations. So just one I want to pick out to highlight would be the situation with mining. So there's a lot of historical literature emphasizing the impact of mining in these remote desert mountains where both species occur. But we really started to learn, in the early 1920s that mining pressure was already on the decline based on shifting economic valuation of the minerals that were being brought out. And so even though mining sort of has a historical legacy effect on these landscapes, today mining is not in any way, shape, or form something that continues to threaten any of these populations. So our survey data and surveys of the contemporary literature indicate that there's no known active mine within 2 miles of any known locality for either species. However, in the mega petition, mining was really emphasized as one of the key threats that they really hung their arguments on for why these species were endangered and should be listed. Okay, so hopefully I've made a case that at least with respect to these 2 species as case studies, that the mega petition certainly was not particularly accurate in the arguments that it was making for the listing status that it was proposing for these 2 species. But that doesn't really reflect necessarily the entire mega petition, or much less the entire mega petition landscape, of course. So I then wanted to see if these case studies were sort of indicative of a broader pattern of a disconnect between scientific knowledge by the petitioners and what we actually knew about those critters. And so there's a great resource on this that sort of helps speak to this issue. So this is a study that was eventually published as a book in 2016. And it was an independent threat metric system using eight different metrics for ranking the imperilment of reptile and amphibian taxa in the western US, specifically in California. And they analyzed 44 different taxa and ranked those taxa with high scores indicating a higher degree of imperilment and a lower score indicating a lower degree of imperilment, and sort of just an independent way of corroborating how these species were selected against sort of existing scientific knowledge, with this resource representing sort of a proxy for what we sort of knew about those species approximately at the same time that the listing petition was issued. And so what we see is that for the two species that I mentioned, the Panamanian alligator lizard and the Inyo mountain salamander, they ranked relatively low on this list. So they ranked 18th and 9th, respectively, in terms of degree of imperilment on this list. And perhaps most tellingly, of the 15 species identified by Thompson et al. As being the most imperiled species on the landscape, only 6 of those 15 species were included in the mega petition. So again, just sort of reflecting this, what I would characterize as a disconnect between existing scientific knowledge and sort of the species selection process for this petitioner in this case. Okay, and then I want to sort of talk a little bit, again, sort of looking more broadly across this entire petition rather than just those 2 case studies, and talking about sort of the inefficiency that comes along with that disconnect between scientific knowledge and realities on the ground. So if we look at those 53 species and sort of look at how they fell out at the early stages of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's analysis process for determining if listing is warranted, the first document that they produce after analyzing the petition is what's called the 90-day review. And during that initial sort of analysis of the data, 17 of those 53 species in that mega petition were deemed unwarranted for listing and were excluded from that process right off the bat. Second thing that I did was to look at sort of the public comment period, which is the next step in that mega petition process by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So they solicit comments from members of the general public, state wildlife agencies, species experts, on whether or not there's additional data that should be included in that petition, or sort of opinion-based or judgment-based recommendations by those authorities on whether or not they feel the petition is warranted. And so pulling some of those comments from what I consider to be quote-unquote authoritative public commentators, which I defined as being either people that have published in the peer-reviewed literature on the species of concern, or a state wildlife agency that has databases and information relevant to the species of concern, that pulled out another 5 species as being probably unwarranted for listing, and they'll probably be pulled out by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as sort of the listing process continues. And so that, together with the 2 case studies that I mentioned, tells us that, you know, at best, this mega petition is really only going to have approximately a 50% listing success rate, assuming that all of these species that were not included in these sort of bins that I pulled out do get listed, which I think is a very an optimistic view of the way this mega petition is going to go. So hopefully I've made the case that, again, just based off of this one mega petition, which may or may not reflect the entire mega petition landscape, but I think it is still some of the first empirical data on this issue to be brought to bear, is that ban by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service of mega petitions was perhaps empirically justified. And it most certainly was not based on right-wing myths, as the Center for Biological Diversity attempted to claim. And so one of my takeaways from this whole process, and sort of talking with the Center for Biological Diversity and talking with state wildlife agencies about this whole process, was that we really need stronger collaboration between people and agencies and organizations that have sort of the data and information and knowledge about these species, and the petitioners themselves, so that we can better inform the selection process for which species are chosen to be petitioned. And that benefits everybody involved, right? So if species are more efficiently proposed, that's going to increase the effectiveness of the act and really accelerate the rate at which species that truly warrant ESA protection are granted that protection before they go extinct. rather than sort of the way the mega petition landscape sort of currently operates or operated, was to sort of clog the listing pipeline with a lot of species that weren't particularly warranted, and sort of preventing or slowing the listing of those truly warranted species. And in part, I think that collaboration is important because when you're dealing with these sort of imperiled species, whether or not they warrant ESA listing or not, you're dealing with, in many cases, a lot of gray literature and unpublished data. These are species that aren't really relatively well known, and so that creates challenges if you're talking about a petitioner that maybe doesn't have access to that data. That can misinform their opinions or judgments on what species actually warrant petitioning or not. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, and thanks for listening.